What if one narrow strip of water could shake gas prices, global trade, and the risk of a wider war overnight? Because after the latest U.S. strike on Iran's coast, this story stopped being about one explosion and became a fight over who gets to control fear itself. If you want clear breakdowns without the noise, tap like, subscribe, and share this with one person who always asks, what's really going on? The U.S. did not hit Tehran. It did not go after a speech, a slogan, or some vague symbol. It hit the part of Iran's strategy that matters most right now, the systems Iran uses to watch the Strait of Hormuz, pressure ships, and remind the world that one narrow waterway can still hold the global economy hostage. That is why this moment matters. On June 26th, U.S. Central Command said American aircraft struck Iranian missile and drone storage locations and coastal radar sites. The official reason was simple. A day earlier, Iran had hit the Singapore-flagged cargo ship Ever Lovely with a one-way attack drone while the ship was leaving the Strait of Hormuz along the Omani coast. In plain English, a commercial ship got hit in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth, and Washington answered fast. But if you stop there, you miss the real story. This was not only about punishing one attack, it was about breaking a pattern. For weeks, the Strait of Hormuz has been the center of a dangerous test. Iran has been trying to shape how ships move through that water. The U.S. and its partners have been trying to keep that water open. Every drone, every warning, every radar screen, every approved route announcement has been part of the same argument. Who decides what passes through Hormuz? That question sounds technical, but it is not technical at all. It is money, it is power, it is pressure, it is leverage over countries far beyond the Gulf. And it is the kind of leverage that can turn one local fight into a global shock. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy chokepoints. That just means it is a narrow place that an enormous amount of oil and gas has to pass through. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says about 20 million barrels of oil moved through the strait in 2024. That is about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade also passed through it. In other words, this is not just a regional lane, it is a global artery, and unlike other routes, there are not many good backups. Some oil can move by pipeline, some cargo can be rerouted, but most of the volume that leaves the Persian Gulf still needs this passage. If the strait becomes too dangerous, insurance costs jump, shipping slows, energy prices react, markets panic before governments even finish their press conferences. So when Iran hits a ship there, it is not just firing at metal, it is firing at confidence. That is why the U.S. chose the targets it did. Look at the list reported by officials and major outlets: missile and drone storage, coastal radar, surveillance infrastructure, communication systems, air defense sites, even mine layer capabilities according to later reporting. These are not random military objects. They are the parts of a strategy built around watching the water, warning ships, threatening ships, and shaping traffic. Think of it this way. If Iran wants influence in the strait, it needs eyes, it needs to see, it needs to track, it needs to know who is moving, where, and how fast. It also needs tools to scare people into following its rules. Drones do that, missiles do that, mines do that, communications do that, radar does that. Remove those pieces and you do not erase Iran. But you do make it harder for Iran to turn the strait into a pressure chamber, and that may be the deepest reason these strikes hurt. They were not designed to wipe out Iran. They were designed to weaken Iran's grip on the one place where it can scare the world without fighting the world head-on. That difference matters. A lot of online commentary treats every strike like the first step to total war. But when you look closely at what was hit and why, a more careful picture appears. This looks less like blind escalation and more like controlled punishment. The message was not, "We are coming for everything." The message was, if you use the strait as a weapon, we will target the machinery that makes that weapon work. That is a very different signal. It also lines up with how the U.S. has behaved through this crisis. Officials have kept repeating the same basic idea. Commercial shipping must move, ceasefire terms must be honored, and attacks on civilian vessels will bring a response. Vice President J.D. Vance said that if Iran had a problem with how the agreement was being applied, it could pick up the phone, but violence would be met with violence. That sentence sounds political. It is. But it also reveals the whole structure of the current American approach. Talk if you want, strike if you must. But if you strike, expect a cost. And that brings us to the part that makes this so dangerous. Iran does not see this crisis the same way Washington does. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Iran appears to be using force in the short term to maintain control over how ships move through Hormuz, while also trying to secure long-term recognition of that control through diplomacy and pressure. Put simply, Iran is not only reacting, it is trying to create a new normal. That matters more than people realize, because once a new normal is accepted at sea, it becomes hard to undo. Ships begin to plan around it. Insurers price around it, governments adjust to it, businesses learn to live with it, and slowly what began as a temporary pressure tactic starts to look like a system. So when the US struck coastal radar and storage sites, it was not only hitting military gear, it was hitting the infrastructure behind a political idea. The idea that Iran can decide which route is safe, which route is legitimate, and which route deserves punishment. And here is where the story gets even more tense. This was happening under the shadow of a ceasefire arrangement that was already fragile. The US called Iran's drone strike on Everlovely a violation of that agreement. Iran pushed back. Iranian officials argued that they were managing the strait, not breaking the ceasefire. One Iranian official even framed the issue as control rather than escalation. That is a chilling phrase when you think about it. Control, not escalation, because it tells you how each side is arguing with different dictionaries. Washington says civilian ships must be safe. Tehran says the waterway falls under its authority. Washington says ceasefire violation. Tehran says enforcement. Washington says freedom of navigation. Tehran says management. When both sides think they are defending order, the path to miscalculation gets very short, and miscalculation is the word you should keep in your head through this entire story. Not because war is guaranteed, but because every side is acting close enough to the edge that one wrong reading can turn a message into a spiral. A drone hits a ship. A strike hits a radar site. A government calls that strike limited. The other side calls it aggression. Another drone appears over another target. Insurance spikes. Navies move closer. Pilots get less time to think. Captains get more pressure from owners. And suddenly the crisis is not moving in speeches anymore. It is moving in seconds. And yet even that does not solve the core problem, because the core problem is not whether the US can hit targets. Of course it can. The real problem is whether repeated limited strikes can stop Iran from believing the pressure campaign is still worth it. That depends on what Iran thinks it is gaining. If Tehran believes control over Hormuz gives it long-term strategic leverage, then a limited airstrike may hurt without changing the logic. It may even harden the logic. Leaders under pressure often decide that backing down after being hit looks more dangerous than pushing forward carefully. That is especially true when the issue touches sovereignty, prestige, and bargaining power all at once. So the question becomes, what hurts more, the damage from the strike or the cost of giving up the tactic? That is the real battlefield, not only in the sky, in the minds of decision makers. And this is where the phrase in your title comes into focus. The US military just hit Iran where it hurts the most. Not because it destroyed everything, not because it shocked the world with size, but because it hit the pressure points behind Iran's leverage strategy. The places that help Iran watch the water, the places that help Iran threaten movement, the places that help Iran turn geography into power. That is where the pain is. Not all pain is measured in dead metal. Some pain is measured in lost control. And for a state trying to shape one of the most important waterways on Earth, losing control is a deep wound. Now, before we go further, if this breakdown is helping you see the bigger picture, save this video, subscribe, and send it to that friend who always says geopolitics is boring, right before asking you why gas prices jump overnight. There is another layer here that most people miss, and it may be the most important one of all. This is not just a military story. It is a credibility story. The US has spent years telling partners in the region that it will defend freedom of navigation. That phrase can sound stiff, but it means something simple. Merchant ships should not have to ask armed actors for permission to move through international trade routes. If Washington lets repeated attacks slide, its promise starts to sound hollow. And when promises sound hollow in a place like the Gulf, countries do not wait around. They hedge, they doubt, they test other options. Even after the American strikes, the maritime threat did not disappear. On June 27th, the Joint Maritime Information Center said the threat level in the strait had risen to substantial after attacks on merchant vessels. Mariners were warned about mines. Naval clearance operations continued. The southern route was widened to allow simultaneous inbound and outbound traffic. That sounds like dry paperwork, but read it for what it really is. The water remained open, but only under active military stress. That is the kind of sentence global markets hear with their nerves, not their ears. Open, but tense. Moving, but dangerous. Managed, but not normal. In many crises, people wait for a clear, closed sign before they panic. In shipping, panic often starts much earlier. It starts when risk becomes hard to price. A route does not need to be fully shut down to cause economic pain. It just needs to become uncertain enough that insurers, operators, and governments start building extra fear into every decision. That fear costs money, and money travels faster than missiles. That is the strange reality of modern deterrence. A route can be officially open and still feel half-closed in the minds of crews. Captains do not sail through headlines. They sail through probabilities. If the odds of a drone, mine, or sudden warning rise even a little, every decision slows. Every call gets checked twice. Every company asks whether one trip is worth one disaster. That hesitation is part of the battlefield too. Iran understands it. The US understands it. And that is why both sides care so much about perception, not just destruction. This is why even a limited confrontation in Hormuz can echo far beyond the Gulf. Asia depends heavily on flows through the strait. The EIA says about 84% of the crude and condensate and 83% of the LNG that moved through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea are deeply exposed to disruptions there. So every tense headline in Hormuz is also a quiet message to factories, utilities, importers, and finance desks thousands of miles away. That also explains why the U.S. response focused on capability rather than symbolism. Symbolic retaliation may look dramatic on TV, but if the goal is to protect shipping, then the most meaningful targets are the ones that help create maritime fear in the first place. Radar that tracks, storage that feeds drones, communications that link units, air defenses that protect the system, mine-laying tools that contaminate routes with anxiety. If you degrade those, you do more than retaliate. You try to shrink the enemy's ability to create the next crisis. Still, there is a reason this strategy may not end the confrontation soon. Because Iran can rebuild, Iran can adapt, Iran can test again, and perhaps most important, Iran can retaliate in ways that stay just below the threshold of full war. That gray zone is where this struggle lives. Not peace, not total war. Something in between. Something sticky, dangerous, and exhausting. According to NPR, after the U.S. strikes, Iran's Revolutionary Guard said it had targeted U.S. military positions in Kuwait and Bahrain. Bahrain accused Iran of targeting it with drones. Iran also threatened to halt negotiations if the attacks continued. Whether each claim produces major damage or not, the larger point is clear. Tehran wants to show that it can answer pressure with pressure, not necessarily symmetrically, but visibly enough to prove it still has options. So where does this go next? This is why you should pay attention not just to what was hit, but to what was not hit. The United States did not seem to choose targets that would obviously force an immediate all-in response. It chose targets tied to maritime coercion. That suggests Washington is still trying to keep the confrontation narrow, even while proving it will use force. It is punishing the behavior without declaring a limitless campaign. That is restraint. Yes, but it is restraint with explosives attached. The problem with restrained force is that its success depends partly on the enemy respecting the boundaries you think you are drawing. If the other side sees those same boundaries as weakness, the signal fails. If it sees them as room to bargain, the signal may work. If it sees them as humiliation, the signal may backfire. And nobody outside the top circles in Tehran knows exactly which interpretation is winning. If you're still with me, here's your second mission. Don't just watch this video. Drop a comment with the one word that explains this crisis best. Then share this with someone who thinks global trade stories don't affect daily life. They do, and this is proof. Now let's strip away the military language and ask the simplest human question. What are both sides actually afraid of? The US is afraid that if attacks on shipping become routine, the entire idea of open maritime trade starts to crack, not only in Hormuz but everywhere. If a state can shape a vital route through drones, mines, and threats, other actors learn from that. That lesson spreads. Iran is afraid of the opposite. It is afraid that if it loses its grip on this moment, It loses leverage in negotiations, loses face at home, and loses one of the few pressure points that makes bigger powers take it seriously. So this is not just about territory or targets, it is about fear of irrelevance on one side and fear of disorder on the other. That is why the strikes landed where they did. Hit the coastal systems and you hit relevance. Keep the water open and you defend order. No wonder both sides think the stakes are huge. But there is another emotional truth under all of this. Ordinary people far away from the Gulf may think these events are distant until the ripple arrives in familiar ways. Higher transport costs, nervous markets, fuel price spikes, tougher insurance, political tension, more military deployments. Another round of headlines that make the world feel less stable than it did last week. This is why the phrase, "where it hurts the most," should not make you think only about explosions. Sometimes the deepest pain is the loss of leverage, timing, and confidence. Sometimes what hurts most is being prevented from turning geography into advantage. And that seems to be what Washington targeted. Not Iran's existence, Iran's method. The method of using the strait as bargaining power. The method of making ships second guess. The method of forcing the region to live under constant low-grade threat. Whether the strikes can truly break that method is another question. A single operation rarely settles a struggle built on years of pressure. Systems can be repaired, routes can be tested again, drones can be relaunched, narratives can be reworked. And leaders can convince themselves that one painful setback is still acceptable if the long-term prize remains large enough. That is why the next signs to watch are not just new explosions. Watch the traffic patterns, watch insurance language, watch official route guidance, watch whether more ships choose the widened southern corridor, watch whether Iranian warnings become louder or quieter, watch whether U.S. strikes remain narrow or start expanding into a broader campaign against communications, air defenses, or sea-based assets. So let's be honest about the balance sheet here. The U.S. showed it can impose immediate costs on Iran's coastal military network. Iran showed it can still create uncertainty in the water and answer politically after being hit. Shipping stayed open, but under real danger. The ceasefire framework stayed alive, but only barely. And the world received a reminder that the global economy still relies on a few fragile corridors that can be shaken by a handful of decisions. So if you are asking whether the U.S. strike changed anything, the answer is yes. It changed the cost of Iran's current playbook. It changed the signal to shipping. It changed the credibility equation. And it may have changed Tehran's calculation about how much pressure it can apply without inviting more painful losses. But if you are asking whether it solved the crisis, the answer is no, not even close, because the real contest is still alive. Who gets to define security in Hormuz? Who decides what counts as lawful passage? Who can absorb more pain without blinking? And who is more afraid of backing down? Those questions are still sitting there, unresolved in the heat above the water. And that is why the next move matters more than the last one. Iran now has to decide whether to rebuild, retaliate, negotiate, or mix all three. The U.S. has to decide how long it can keep using limited force without either looking ineffective or slipping into something larger. Regional states have to decide how openly they align. Shipping firms have to decide how much risk they can price in. And markets have to decide whether to believe the route is merely dangerous or truly unstable. The world does not need a massive war for this crisis to hurt. It only needs a narrow waterway to stay just unstable enough, just armed enough, and just unpredictable enough that fear becomes part of normal business. And that is why the U.S. did not just hit Iran. It hit the tools Iran uses to make the world hesitate. Its eyes on the water, its reach over shipping, its ability to turn a route into a warning. That is where the strike cut deepest. Not because the damage looked dramatic on a screen, because it threatened the logic behind Iran's pressure campaign. And when you threaten the logic, you threaten the future of the strategy itself. So the next time you hear that a ship was diverted, a route was widened, or a radar site was struck, do not treat it like background noise from a faraway conflict. Treat it like what it is. A contest over whether global trade moves by rules or by fear. A contest over whether limited force can stop coercion without becoming chaos. A contest over whether the world's most important narrow passage can stay open without becoming the trigger for something far larger. That is the story now. And until one side truly changes its calculation, every ship that enters Hormuz will be sailing through more than water. it will be sailing through a test of power, nerve, and restraint. If you want more scripts like this that turn breaking headlines into clear stories you can actually feel, hit subscribe, share this video, and come back for the next one, because the next signal from Hormuz may not just move markets, it may decide who blinked first.